Welcome to week one of the course. I just want to say some things about the week's material. This is something that I do for each module, where in addition to the readings and the essay assignment, discussion board, study questions, I will be talking about the readings. This is really more or less a supplement for what would be class time. That is, I feel part of my job as a teacher is to talk about the readings. The thing about the readings for this course, I would say, is that by and large, they're pretty pretty accessible. There's not, especially this week with these things, there's not much that I need to do, I think. The excerpt from Game of Thrones, a clip from Game of Thrones, the poem by Donne, and the brief excerpt from the book of Ecclesiastes are all very accessible things. So, but I'd like to share with you maybe some of the reasons that I chose these things and why I chose them. For the first module, which I'm calling Preliminary Attitudes Towards Death, that is preliminary in the sense that we're just sort of getting started here and we're trying to get a certain view of what it is exactly that we're talking about before we maybe get more rigorous in module 2 with the theories of death. Just sort of our take on different takes on death, just different general takes on death, just general apprehensions of death from different sources. If you look at this, click on here, this video from Game of Thrones. This is from the first season of Game of Thrones, which I thought was really quite good. And this particular scene impressed me very much, which is a scene of a little sword fighting lesson, fencing lesson between a little girl and her teacher, in which he's teaching her how to fight with a sword, but really instructing her on life. And just watching it, no reason for me to talk about it too much. Except that I thought that what is said there about death is actually quite interesting. When the fencing master asks her, if this is a fictional world, Game of Thrones, it doesn't exist, so, but it has its own sort of alternative reality sort of culture, and in that there's a religion, and he asks her whether she prays to the gods. She basically says she prays to all of the gods, and he tells her, well, there's only one God. There's only one God, and his name is death. And what do we say to death? Not today. Very important part of this, I think, the background of this show. This notion that death can be viewed as a god is a very interesting one to me. Obviously, it's not in any sort of orthodox religion that we know. Death is not a god. I mean, maybe the ancient religions, Egypt, other Greek polytheism, death was personified as a god, but we don't normally think that way, and I'm not asking you to, except that it's interesting to view death as a force. The idea that what has ultimate power over us is mortality, and it's the inescapable force that we're all sooner or later going to succumb to. All we can do is say not today and try to defer it, but that ultimate power over us is a certain view of what death is, that it is this ineluctable, unavoidable, complete force over us, that it is the real, it is in a certain sense, the most powerful force in the universe, because it's the one that we know will eventually do away with us. So one particular view of death and what death is, I think very much contrasting with that is the famous poem by Donne that I've given you. It's commonly known as Death Be Not Proud. Its official name is Holy Sonnet number something or other. I don't know, but everyone knows it is Death Be Not Proud, which is one of my favorite poems of all time, and certainly, in my opinion, the greatest poem that I know of ever written about death, which presents us with an entirely different view of what death is. And it acknowledges that Game of Thrones idea that death is a kind of a god, this most powerful force over us, and acknowledges our belief that that is what death is, but then it dismisses that. It totally turns that around. I'll just read it through and comment on it. It's a wonderful poem. You should know it. And it's a wonderful thing to have in your repertoire. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. That is, Donne is acknowledging that many have acknowledged death to be this great force, just as the fencing master did to the little girl. Death, be not proud. First thing he says, for though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. This defiance of death, this is saying that some have said that death is mighty and dreadful, but it's not true, because while it may seem that death is killing people, it's not. Now, most times when you hear this very famous poem, it's only these first four lines that get quoted, which is a shame, because without reading the rest of the poem, you cannot really understand the basis of Donne's message, which is a Christian message. That is, this defiance of death, is saying, those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that death can kill you in a certain respect. So what is the basis of his claim that it can? He says, from rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. That is, we think about rest and sleep, which are but the kind of images of death, death being a kind of a larger rest, permanent sleep. From rest and sleep, we get much pleasure. And there are your pictures, right? So then from thee, much more must flow. That is, more pleasure. And soonest our best men with thee do go, which I think is another way of putting the old cliche that only the good die young. Rest of their bones and soul's delivery. That is, when people die, it's a rest, and soul's delivery. That's where he really starts to introduce the Christian idea. Thou art slave. And remember, he's addressing death. Thou, death, you're a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. That is, death itself is controlled by fate and chance, and human beings who engage in killing, right? And dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, meaning there's something kind of squalid about death. Death is associated with poison, with surreptitious killing, with war, with illness. And popular charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. In a sense, why should you be proud? Opium and charms, I'm not really sure even by charms, can make us sleep, and better than thy stroke, right? Why swellest thou then? Why are you puffed up? There's no reason to be. And here the last two lines are really crucial. One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. That is absolutely 100% avowedly a Christian statement. One short sleep past, we wake eternally. It's talking about the resurrection of the dead. And death shall be no more. This is the notion that Christ, the coming of Christ for a Christian is the triumph over death. Because Christ brings salvation, a possibility of salvation to human beings. And death shall be no more. That is, with the resurrection of dead, with salvation, comes eternal life. So death, thou shalt die, is the ultimate, I would say, the ultimate Christian defiance of death. And it really does depend upon the idea of Christ being the victor over death through the resurrection of the dead. So it's an incredible poem, and it is probably, again, repeating myself, one of my favorite poems of all time, and certainly a profound comment on the human relationship with death. But it is very specifically Christian, and it does dismiss death as a power only because of the power of salvation. Last thing we're looking at this week is an excerpt from the book of Ecclesiastes. This is part of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the book of Ecclesiastes is something that everybody should be familiar with, if only because it is a great challenge. Many a reader of the Bible has been puzzled at some of the things said in the book of Ecclesiastes because they don't seem to fit into what we normally think of as a Judeo-Christian tradition. So this is something that everyone should look at, but I thought that this was also a challenge to us in terms of a conception of death. That might be something that would be good to keep in mind. This is from chapter 3, verses 18 through 22. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. Pretty amazing thing to read in the Bible, to see somebody say that human beings and animals have the same fate. That is, they're both mortal creatures. And they, just as animals die, human beings die, and there's no difference. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place, all come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward, and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there's nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? It's in the first part of it I really want to focus on, because certainly it is a very challenging view to anybody who's reading the Bible for spiritual sustenance, to read such a stark assessment of human mortality, to say that human beings die like animals. Who's to say that our spirit goes up into heaven while the animal just becomes dust and is no more? Certainly looks on the surface, if one's going by the actual observation of human life and human death, certainly looks on the surface like human beings die like animals. That is, just as animals have their time on earth and then they are gone forever and become nothing. It certainly does seem like, on the surface at least, that human beings suffer the same fate. And a consequence of this, he says, well, then, everything's meaningless, because death is the great, again, this is a thing that makes everything sort of, makes us call into question the very meaning of our lives. Let's just put it that way. So really, a really incredible thing to find in the Bible, and a great challenge. Obviously, it's not the Christian message. I don't think it's the Jewish message either, in terms of an overall assessment of the Old Testament. But certainly it's something very striking and provocative. I don't know if the three things that I've given you for this week somehow form any kind of related whole, certainly not any kind of systematic thing. I just wanted to start with 2 or 3 views of death, which are very striking, maybe not completely worked out, but 3 ways in which death is is conceived and ways to start thinking about what death is.